They thought humiliation would be enough. 2 guards, a closed door, and the quiet of my father's pen pressing into my palm like a relic no one else noticed. It began, as betrayals often do, with platitudes. Routine agenda, the calendar had promised. Q3 numbers, research budget. Carry on, Olivia. But the faces were wrong the moment I stepped into the boardroom. The chairs didn't shift. Eyes didn't lift. My stepfather, Richard, sat at the head of the table as if he'd been born in that chair. The others, the ones who had toasted me as COO, studied their reflections in the polished wood instead of meeting my gaze. They told me I lacked senior leadership experience. The phrasing was rehearsed, sanded free of courage, spoken like a disclaimer at the end of a pharmaceutical ad. Margaret dabbed her eyes with a tissue dry as parchment. Thomas shuffled papers that didn't need shuffling. Someone murmured protocol when I asked about security. The old boardroom clock ticked so loudly it might have been a metronome for cowardice. I remember laughing, an involuntary, brittle sound, as if humor could keep the floor from tilting. It couldn't. 2 guards appeared, and suddenly I was a problem to be moved, a file to be archived. When the doors closed behind me, the building changed temperature. My father used to say that Morgan Biotech ran on the heat of its people, the late-night experiments, the 6 a.m. inventory counts, the coffee, the color of motor oil. I grew up in that heat. Summers in the warehouse, learning SKUs with men who called me kiddo until I outcounted them. Months in R&D pipetting until the muscles at the base of my thumb ached. Sales ride-alongs with field reps who knew every oncologist on a first-name basis. "You can't lead what you don't understand," Dad would say, crinkling his eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He taught me to read balance sheets like weather charts and to treat a lab bench like sacred ground. He taught me that mission wasn't a slide deck, it was a promise. He died at his desk on a Tuesday. The coroner said it was instant. I found him with the morning's coffee still warm, his notes on an immunotherapy protocol clipped neatly, his handwriting steady, precise. The funeral came and went in a gust of black fabric and language made of cliches. At the graveside, hands squeezed mine, voices promised continuity. "We'll protect his legacy," Margaret had said, a phrase that now tasted like aspirin ground between teeth. 3 weeks. That's how long they waited to replace the promise with the policy, to turn condolences into a vote. The guards at the elevator didn't touch me. They didn't have to. The humiliation was in the choreography, the walk through the lobby I'd crossed 1,000 times, the employees who pretended not to watch but watched everything, the small gasp from the receptionist who couldn't catch it in time. I pressed the pen into my pocket, a small, ridiculous act of salvage. They'd get the title, the parking space, the profile on the website. They wouldn't get that. In the car, my hand shook so hard the key fumbled against the ignition. Rage doesn't feel like fire at first. It feels like cold, like air pulled out of a room. I drove without deciding to, a straight line through city streets until asphalt gave way to grass and the cemetery gates opened. For a while, I just sat. It's strange the way grief and strategy share a border. If you stand still long enough, one becomes the other. The engine ticked as it cooled. A crow hopped along the fence line. I could smell cut grass and gasoline and the cheap pine of the new wood used for the temporary sign. Eventually, I opened the door and walked to his headstone, fresh granite still dusty around the edges. "I'm sorry," I heard myself say, though I meant something closer to, "I will not let this be the last chapter." The wind moved through the trees like a long breath. I put my palm on the stone, feeling the cool of it, and then I did what Dad had trained me to do since I was old enough to understand the difference between anger and action. I started a plan. Founders' companies are the ripest fruit in the market garden, the sweet ones thieves covet. After a founder dies, the succession premium dissolves and vultures circle. I'd learned this in case studies, in late-night talks with Dad when he covered corporate war stories with the same patience he used to explain receptor-ligand interactions. Power isn't a chair, he'd said. Power is the coalition that lets you sit in it. So I built one in my head, right there at his grave. Name by name, stake by stake, leverage by leverage. Back home, my apartment became a war room. I didn't mean to do it. I simply began, and the room followed. Whiteboards leaned against walls like sails. Sticky notes multiplied, green for allies, yellow for possibles, red for lost causes. The pen scratched across legal pads with a steadiness my pulse didn't have yet. The board believed their narrative would hold. The grieving daughter, the impulsive COO, the sentimental heir. They underestimated the muscle memory of apprenticeship. They forgot I'd sat in budget meetings as a teenager, that I'd seen how supply chain delays ripple into clinical trial timelines, that I knew what our nurses' faces looked like when the grant money cleared. Every strategy needs a number. Mine was 75. In a bylaw amended when we went public, buried in language no one had read in a decade, lived an emergency provision. Any shareholder or coalition controlling 75% of outstanding shares could call an extraordinary meeting and reverse board decisions with immediate effect. My father's estate, my inheritance, held 22. On paper, I needed 53 more. In my hands, I needed relationships. I had some that were made of gratitude, some made of shared mission, a few made of anger. Anger is a surprisingly reliable adhesive. Before any of that, I needed air. I ran at dusk along the river, the city's health monitor lights blinking on one by one across the water. Each footfall steadied something feral inside me. When I came home, I opened my laptop and hired a private investigator recommended by a college roommate whose divorce had taught her the difference between accusation and evidence. Everything, I told him. Everything I told. Every meeting, every encrypted whisper, every oddly timed sale. I need a map. He didn't promise. Professionals don't. He just said, give me 48 hours to see what's possible. While he worked, I made calls, not to the people the board expected, not to the bankers who liked their deals neat, or the analysts who measured value in quarters. I called the head of oncology who'd spent 15 years building our protocols and had stock options that could move a needle. I called the pension fund manager at St. Mary's, our earliest clinical partner, who'd told me once over bad conference coffee that he believed in companies that saved lives with their profit, not despite it. I called mid-level employees who held slivers of shares but mountains of belief. Each conversation began with the same two truths. I was out, and the board planned to sell the heart of the company to Apex. I didn't have to embellish. The facts were indecent enough. The PI's first report hit my inbox at 3:17 a.m., the hour when cities sleep and conspiracies don't. Radiant lines of numbers ran through shell companies like a nervous system, small blocks of shares, always below reporting thresholds, washing through offshore channels and pooling around one familiar name, the personal attorney of the man who had just told me I wasn't ready. Emails followed, plucked from a server by a sympathetic soul tired of pretending loyalty was the same thing as silence. They'd called it Phase 1, consolidate control, move quickly, keep the daughter grieving and therefore slow. The Apex deal was their endgame, not their strategy. The strategy was exhaustion. Of me, of employees, of anyone who might stand up long enough to see the sell-off for what it was. By dawn, I knew two things with a clarity that made breakfast unnecessary. 1. Their plan was older than my father's grave. 2. Their arrogance would be my lever. I printed what mattered and slid it into a folder thick enough to thud when it landed on a table. Then I dressed for the kind of day that requires 3 different faces: grieving daughter for those who needed softness, wronged executive for those who needed steel, and patient hunter for myself. Outside, the city pretended it was just another weekday. trucks hissed. A barista handed me a coffee and said, "Rough morning?" I smiled like any other patron who hadn't slept. Inside the cup's heat, my hands stopped shaking. I pictured Margaret's tissue, Thomas's papers, Richard's chair. I pictured my father's pen, cool against my palm, and the bylaw that would turn grief into geometry. 75%. A number simple enough to write on a napkin. A number big enough to move the earth. This is how an oath begins, not with raised voices or slamming doors, but with ink, with a list of names, with the quiet knowledge that the people who dragged you through a lobby didn't end your story, only titled the next chapter. I opened my notebook and wrote it plainly, so I couldn't forget if the day turned me loose. We take back what was built to heal. We do it clean. We do it completely. We do it now. The first rule of corporate war is simple. You never win on sympathy. Sympathy is a headline. Leverage is a vote. The investigator's report didn't just reveal betrayal. It gave me a map of where to dig and where to plant charges. Every offshore transfer, every encrypted message was a breadcrumb that led back to the board's appetite for something quick, something easy, something that would never have survived scrutiny in daylight. But maps don't move armies. People do. And I needed an army equal to 75%. At night, my apartment became less home and more command post. The whiteboards multiplied until I'd run out of wall space. Index cards with shareholder names fluttered in the breeze from the open window, like a deck of cards mid-shuffle. My handwriting sharpened into a code. Green dots for confirmed allies, yellow stripes for potentials, red X's for the captured. Each name carried weight. A technician with 0.5%, a pension fund with 3%. Most outsiders would have dismissed these as crumbs. But I knew better. Coalitions are made out of crumbs until the loaf tips the scale. The bylaws were my scripture. Section 47B, subsection 3. A clause most of the current board hadn't even read. Lawyers had drafted it years ago to appease regulators during the IPO. My father insisted it stay in, just in case. He had that instinct founders carry, the sense that someday the people you trust most will be the ones you must defend against. And there it was, in black and white, the nuclear option. 75% wasn't just control, it was sovereignty, the power to reverse, erase, rewrite. The kind of clause that turns a daughter into a general. But numbers alone don't inspire. Mission does. My first call was to Dr. Sarah Winters. She'd been in oncology research longer than I'd been alive, her lab coat as much armor as uniform. When she picked up, I heard exhaustion in her voice, the background hum of centrifuges spinning late into the night. I didn't need to convince her with rhetoric. I told her what the board planned: Apex stripping patents, shelving treatments, monetizing disease. Silence stretched, and then her voice cut through. Your father gave me my career when no one else would. You have my shares. You have me. 2% added to my tally, but more than that, I had a lieutenant. With Sarah, the dominoes began to fall. St. Mary's pension fund had 3%, small in a world of billions, but large in a battle of margins. Over burnt coffee in a downtown diner, I slid the investigator's evidence across the table. The manager's face drained as he read. If Apex controls this, low-income patients lose everything, he whispered. No subsidized programs, no exceptions. His hands trembled as he signed. That night, I updated the wall. Another 3%, shaded green. Still, the gap yawned. My father's 22% plus Sarah's 2 plus St. Mary's 3. That was 27. A third of the way, but far from enough. And the board's 31 still loomed like a fortress. I needed scale. I needed someone with clout, credibility, and the ability to shift momentum in the market itself. That someone called me first. Elena Volkov of North Star Investments, 7%. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Ms. Morgan, we've noticed interesting activity in your company's shares. Anonymous LLCs accumulating in Delaware. Not sloppy, but not invisible. Yours? My pulse jumped, but I held steady. Let's say I'm not as defeated as they'd like to think. Her laugh was soft, but without warmth. Good. Richard has been promising us favorable terms post-acquisition. I despise being taken for granted. My 7% is yours on one condition. You implement your father's 5-year plan, the one the board dismissed as impractical. Personalized medicine, community clinics. Ambitious, yes, but real growth. You deliver that, and North Star delivers me. I didn't even pause. Done. When I hung up, the wall read 34%. But more than numbers, I had shifted the current. When North Star moved, others would watch. Still, to reach 75, I needed breadth as much as depth. Employees, early investors, families who had watched the company grow like a child of their own. They didn't hold huge percentages, but they carried belief. And belief spreads like wildfire when betrayal becomes visible. I couldn't approach them openly. The board had eyes everywhere. So I learned the art of coincidence. I ran into Marcus Thompson, senior lab tech, at his daughter's soccer game. His jaw was tight when he saw me. "They told us you abandoned the company," he said. I shook my head. "They threw me out, and they'll throw you out too once Apex guts the labs." His expression hardened into steel. 0.5% in my pocket, and the first whispers of revolt among the staff. Day by day, I built. Cafes became recruitment centers. Gym treadmills turned into conference tables. Each conversation began with disbelief, turned to outrage, and ended with signatures. Green dots spread across my whiteboards like ivy reclaiming stone. Still, the numbers weren't enough. Not yet. So I turned to smoke and mirrors. Prometheus Biosystems, a phantom rival incorporated with just enough noise to reach the board's ears. A LinkedIn post, a carefully staged lunch, a lease in a building where gossip traveled faster than elevators. If they were watching me, I would give them a play to watch. They'd chase shadows while I built substance. "She's starting her own company," whispers ran through the halls. "She's poaching our talent." The board flinched. They called emergency meetings. They issued memos. And while they stared at the ghost in front of them, I gathered the army behind their backs. Rumors, headlines, tiny cracks in investor confidence. The stock price trembled, 8% drop, then 15. Nervous holders sold at losses. I scooped every share I could, funneling funds through the very shell structures Richard thought belonged to him alone. My inheritance liquidated. My savings emptied. Even my car sold, replaced by subway rides that made me feel more soldier than executive. Piece by piece, the gap narrowed. On paper, I was still short. But power isn't only in the percentage you hold, it's in the belief you spread, the story you tell. And my story was beginning to echo in the right places. I could feel it in the sidelong glances at cafes, the whispers in research labs, the hesitant but growing resolve of people who had loved my father's vision and hated the board's betrayal. The board believed grief had made me weak. They didn't see what grief makes when it hardens into purpose. The first war room tally had seemed impossible. 75. But by the time I closed my notebook one night, evidence spread across the floor like confetti. After a battle parade, I knew something else. The impossible had become inevitable, and inevitability, when dressed in patience, is the sharpest weapon of all. Coalitions are not born. They are stitched together, thread by thread, often in places that look nothing like war rooms. Mine began in the corners of coffee shops, on the bleachers of children's soccer games, and in the whispers of late-night phone calls where voices carried both fear and defiance. If the board had surveillance cameras in the hallways of Morgan Biotech, I had the subtler kind, human memory, sharpened by betrayal. Dr. Sarah Winters became my first lieutenant, a soldier in a lab coat. Her 2% was a seed, but her credibility among the research staff gave me more than numbers. It gave me legitimacy. She was living proof that the company had once valued principle over profit. Through her, I gained entry to circles the board had ignored: researchers, hospital administrators, clinicians who owed their careers or their patients' lives to the company my father built. When Sarah vouched for me, walls opened. Robert Chen at St. Mary's Pension Fund had already committed his 3%, shaken by the evidence I'd shown him. But it was his promise to call friends that mattered more. Pension funds talk to each other, especially when patient care is on the line. By the end of a week, I had tentative signals from 2 more hospitals, each small but together enough to turn a rumor into a ripple. Employees were trickier. Their stakes were smaller, scattered like breadcrumbs, but collectively they could amount to something formidable. I couldn't walk back into the labs without raising alarms, so I became a shadow at the margins of their lives. I accidentally bumped into Marcus Thompson at the grocery store, and later a group of junior analysts at the gym. I lingered at the cafe across the street from headquarters during lunch hours, watching faces flicker with recognition before I invited them to sit. Every conversation was a mirror. Their shock at the board's betrayal reflected back as my resolve. By the end of 3 weeks, 17 employees had pledged their fractions, tiny shares stacking into whole numbers. My whiteboard tally climbed, the yellow cards turning green one by one. But the real breakthrough came from someone who had never liked me. Elena Volkov of North Star Investments was a name I'd circled in red. Too sharp, too calculating, too seasoned to risk an approach. And then she called me. Her voice was cool, professional, every syllable measured. "Ms. Morgan, we've noticed your shadow in the market. Small acquisitions through Delaware LLCs. Careful but not invisible." My throat went dry, but I forced myself to answer lightly. "Then you know I'm not finished." She didn't laugh. Instead, she laid her card on the table. "Richard has been promising my competitors everything. He assumes North Star will tolerate crumbs. He assumes wrong. I'll deliver our 7% on one condition: that you revive the 5-year strategic plan your father presented last year, the one the current board dismissed." My father's last plan: clinics in underserved communities, personalized medicine programs, ambitious investments in areas Wall Street had called too risky. It was exactly what they had buried with him. I didn't hesitate. "Done," I said. Elena's 7% joined my coalition. My wall shifted from possibility to inevitability. The ripple became a wave. The board noticed. Whispers reached me. Richard pacing late at night, Thomas calling investors with new urgency, Margaret lobbying employees with promises of stability. Their strategy was containment. Mine was momentum. And momentum is contagious. I learned to weaponize rumor. Prometheus Biosystems, my phantom company, became the perfect decoy. A LinkedIn post here, a staged lunch there, a casual remark at a conference about New Horizons. The board devoured the bait. Memos circulated about intellectual property, about non-compete clauses. They wasted meetings chasing shadows while I built strength in daylight. Employees whispered that I was poaching talent. Analysts speculated about competing patents. Every rumor kept the board busy defending against an enemy that didn't exist, leaving me free to gather an army that did. Meanwhile, the market trembled. Uncertainty bled into the stock price, an 8% drop, then 15%, and small investors began to sell. Fear is predictable. Fear is also profitable if you know what you're looking for. Through my network of Delaware entities, I scooped up every share I could. My inheritance dwindled, my savings vanished, even my car was sold to feed the war chest. Each acquisition was another brick in the wall of 75. At night, I'd stand before the boards in my apartment, markers squeaking across the surface as I updated totals. Green dominated now, yellow was shrinking. Red still loomed, but not invincible. Each percentage point carried stories of lab techs who trusted me, of pension funds that couldn't stomach Apex, of investors who remembered what it felt like to believe in something beyond quarterly returns. Coalitions don't announce themselves. They accumulate in silence, in sidelong glances and folded signatures. By week 6, I had control of more than half the company on paper, and more in spirit. I wasn't at 75 yet, but I was close enough that the air around me vibrated with inevitability. And inevitability, once it enters the bloodstream of a company, spreads faster than any virus. The board could feel it. The employees could feel it. Even I, sitting alone in an apartment lined with whiteboards and empty coffee cups, could feel it humming in my bones. The war wasn't won, but for the first time I knew it could be. Momentum is a dangerous thing. Once it starts rolling downhill, it doesn't stop until it hits something immovable or until it consumes everything in its path. By week 7, my coalition wasn't just growing, it was accelerating. Every percentage point I gained seemed to magnetize another. North Star's 7% had opened the dam. Now, smaller funds and early investors were flowing to me almost daily. The Bernstein Family Trust, who had backed my father's first prototype when it was just a sketch in his notebook, pledged 4%. The California Teachers Pension Fund added 3%, tired of the board's secrecy. By the time I pinned their commitments to my war room wall, my coalition controlled over 51%. A majority, yes, but not the nuclear 75% that would render the board powerless. The board wasn't idle. They could feel the ground slipping, and desperation breeds boldness. Surveillance cars appeared outside my building. Coincidental encounters with shareholders tried to probe my intentions. Lawyers began drafting letters filled with accusations of corporate sabotage and breach of fiduciary duty. Then the board fired their first real shot, a cease and desist accusing me of corporate espionage and interference with the Apex deal. It was flimsy, almost laughable, but it wasn't meant to win in court. It was meant to rattle me, to remind me that they had resources I didn't. I didn't flinch. Instead, I counterfiled. Breach of fiduciary duty, waste of corporate assets, self-dealing. And to make sure the world paid attention, I attached just enough evidence to make the press salivate. Journalists love words like embezzlement and kickbacks. The next morning, headlines screamed, "Founder's daughter accuses Morgan board of corporate treason." The board had tried to intimidate me. Instead, they handed me a megaphone. Still, I needed the missing pieces to cross 75%. That's when Frank Morrison re-entered my life. My father's first CFO, retired to Napa Vineyards, long thought finished with corporate wars. One midnight, my phone rang. "Olivia?" His voice gravelly. "I've been watching. Your father never trusted Richard. Asked me to keep records, just in case. I think it's time you saw them." The next evening, Frank arrived at my apartment carrying a banker's box. Inside were documents more damning than anything my investigator had uncovered. Records of Richard skimming from R&D budgets for years, routing money through phantom contractors. Emails of board members coordinating trades around FDA announcements. Even a recording, 2 years old, of Richard saying aloud what the others had only implied: "Once James is out of the way, one way or another, we'll carve this company up." I felt the blood drain from my face as the tape played. "You wore a wire?" I asked. Frank shrugged. "Your father. He suspected. He wanted a record if the worst happened. He trusted me to keep it. In that moment, my war gained a second front. I wasn't just fighting for control. I was preparing the ground for destruction, legal, financial, reputational. If I timed it right, I wouldn't just win the company back. I would salt the earth beneath the conspirators. From then on, I moved like a general counting down to battle. T-minus 7 days. I leaked whispers about irregularities in Morgan Biotech's books. T-minus 6. An SEC examiner coincidentally began reviewing filings. T-minus 5. Allies inside the company began wearing small pins. Caduceus symbols, the old logo my father had once chosen, a quiet rebellion visible in hallways and labs. T-minus 4. Dr. Kim Leong, my supposed defector, staged a conversation about how outdated Morgan looked compared to Prometheus. A known board informant carried the message back as planned. Panic spread. Meanwhile, the stock wobbled again. Nervous holders fled. My Delaware entities bought everything they could. My 75% climbed to 78%, then 80%. Enough to be untouchable, but I didn't reveal it. Not yet. Timing was everything. T-minus 3. My mother called. Her voice was quiet, but urgent. Richard's been pacing, making calls. I overheard him mention alternative measures if the vote doesn't go their way. Olivia, be careful. I told her to stay with my aunt, away from the house. She may have chosen him once, but she wasn't blind anymore. Desperate men make dangerous mistakes. T-minus 2. My lawyer, Janet, delivered a thick countersuit to the board's counsel. Breach of duty, waste of assets, fraud. She hinted at more evidence waiting in sealed envelopes. The press caught wind. Headlines flared. Corporate battle turns nuclear. T-minus 1. I stood in my war room one last time, walls covered in green. 80.3% confirmed. Frank's evidence packaged and ready to trigger federal investigation. Every proxy agreement signed. Every ally briefed. Tomorrow, the board would believe they were voting to sell my father's life's work to Apex. Instead, they would walk into their own execution. The night before battle, I couldn't sleep. I poured a glass of my father's scotch, the bottle I had saved from his office before they cleared it out. I sat by the window, city lights flickering, phone buzzing with messages from allies. Give them hell. We're ready. Your father would be proud. I whispered to the glass. Tomorrow, we end this. The morning of the shareholder meeting felt like walking into a storm you've been tracking for months. Every warning light flashing, every gust calculated. And yet the air still crackled with danger. I dressed deliberately, pulling on the deep blue suit my father had called his armor color. Emma, my oldest friend, drove me downtown. Outside the Morgan Biotech Tower, a forest of cameras and microphones swayed like reeds in the wind. Reporters shouted questions. Is it true you control 80%? Will you block the Apex deal? I didn't answer. The story would tell itself soon enough. Inside, Jerome, the security guard who had watched me grow up, lifted his eyes. For a heartbeat, the years seemed to fall away. "Welcome back, Ms. Morgan," he murmured. His voice steadied me more than I expected. At 9:30 sharp, I pushed open the boardroom doors. The conversation froze. Richard's face darkened from red to white, then back to red, a pendulum of fury. "You have no right to be here," he snapped. "Security!" "Actually," I said, laying my briefcase on the table, "I have every right." I clicked open the case and pulled out the stack of proxy agreements, hundreds of pages, each signed and notarized. The sound of paper on wood echoed like a gavel. I currently control 80.3% of Morgan Biotech Solutions. Section 47B of our bylaws grants me authority to call an extraordinary meeting and reverse any board decision, including my removal. The room erupted. Thomas Garrett leapt to his feet. "Impossible. We tracked every trade." "You tracked what I wanted you to track," I replied, sliding another sheet across the table. Delaware LLC registrations, shell company trails, binding proxy agreements. While you were chasing ghosts, I was collecting reality. Margaret's hand trembled as she whispered, "Those Delaware entities, all you?" "Perfectly legal," I said, "unlike coordinating insider trades through Cayman accounts or pocketing Apex kickbacks." I let the pause hang. "Yes, I have those records too." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "You're bluffing!" I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Frank Morrison says hello." His face drained. He knew what that meant: the banker's box, the receipts, the tape. Your phantom contractors, your skimming from R&D budgets, your promises to Apex. It's all documented. And at exactly 10:31 a.m., the SEC will have copies. For the first time, silence. Not the silence of calculation, but of fear. My lawyer, Janet, entered with boxes of evidence, rolling them in like artillery. "For the record," she said crisply, "Ms. Morgan is exercising her right under Section 47B. Effective immediately, all current board decisions are void." "You can't," Thomas sputtered. "I already have," I answered. One by one, they broke. Margaret folded first, sliding the resignation letter Janet had prepared. Thomas followed, his silver tongue finally useless. Each signature was a nail in the coffin of their scheme. Only Richard remained, his eyes burning with venom. "You think this is over? Apex has contracts, international partners. You'll destroy billions in value with this tantrum." "Whose value?" I asked, pulling out the private Apex agreements with his name at the bottom. "Your $30 million payout? Margaret's 15, Thomas's 20? You were ready to sell out patients and employees for blood money. That ends today." He sneered. "You're just like your father, stubborn, naive, sanctimonious." "Thank you," I said softly. "That's the kindest thing you've ever said to me." I turned to security. "Escort them out. Collect their badges and devices. Their personal belongings will be returned after review." The irony was a blade. 3 months ago they'd had me marched out like a criminal. Now it was their turn. They filed past me, faces gray with shock. Richard stopped at the door. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Yes," I said, steady as stone. "It is." When the door shut behind them, the room exhaled. I sank into my father's chair, the one Richard had claimed. For a long moment I simply sat there, hand resting on the polished wood. Not as COO, not as heir, but as the rightful majority owner who had won the war they started. Outside, my phone buzzed. Emma's message. "They're out. Reporters already circling. Did you win?" I typed back. "We won." And for the first time since that Thursday coup, I allowed myself to believe it. When the boardroom finally emptied, the silence felt almost holy. Janet busied herself with paperwork, confirming proxies, preparing filings for the SEC, but I stayed still in my father's chair, breathing in the gravity of the moment. The seat no longer felt stolen. It felt restored. For months my apartment had been a bunker, my life reduced to strategy and shadows. Now the battlefield was mine, and victory didn't roar. It hummed, low and steady, like the heartbeat of the company itself. The first act of restoration was for the people, not the market. I pulled out Morgan Biotech letterhead, set down my father's lucky pen, the one I had carried out in my pocket the day they exiled me, and wrote by hand. "To all Morgan Biotech employees, today marks a new chapter. The attempted sale to Apex is terminated. Your jobs are secure. Our mission continues. Innovation with purpose, profits with principle, success with soul. These values will guide us forward." When I signed my name, sunlight broke through the blinds, a golden wash across the polished table. It felt like his hand on my shoulder, one more time. The headlines erupted within hours. "Board ousted in founder's daughter coup. Morgan Biotech saved from Apex sale. SEC opens investigation into former directors. Reporters camped outside the building. Investors dialed frantically. Employees streamed messages of relief and defiance. Photos of lab teams toasting, technicians wearing the old caduceus pin, research staff vowing to finish the protocols Richard had tried to bury. By afternoon, the new board assembled. Frank Morrison took his seat again, slower than years past, but still sharp-eyed. Dr. Sarah Winters, representing research. Pension fund representatives who had chosen mission over margin. People who understood that governance wasn't about quarterly acrobatics, it was about stewardship. We moved quickly. Funding was restored for the Parkinson's research Richard had slashed. The compassionate use program expanded. And most important, we revived my father's 5-year plan. Personalized medicine, clinics in underserved communities, bold steps the old board had called too ambitious. I could almost hear Dad's laugh, that half-crooked smile he wore when someone told him something couldn't be done. That evening, alone in his office, my office now, I poured 2 glasses of scotch, one for me, one for him, left untouched on the desk. "We did it, Dad," I whispered to the empty chair. "They thought they could erase you, sell you for parts. They forgot the lesson you taught me. Real power isn't in contracts or titles. It's in people, in those who believe." My phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was lighter than I'd heard in years. Richard's packing. His lawyer called about frozen assets, federal investigators. "Olivia, I filed for divorce this morning." She laughed softly, like someone laying down a burden. "Your father would have wanted me free of him, and now I am." We said little else. We didn't need to. The war had ended, and the cost had been counted. Later, I stood before the wall of photographs in the lobby, snapshots of breakthroughs, smiling patients, company milestones. My father's eyes looked back from more than one frame, bright and certain. Soon there would be new photos, new lives saved. But the foundation was his, and now it was safe again. As the city outside lit up with evening neon, I felt the fatigue of months crash into me. The sleepless nights, the endless calculations, the whispered phone calls in cafes. Yet beneath the exhaustion was something harder, cleaner: satisfaction. They had tried to reduce me to a footnote. Instead, they had become one in my story. In business, betrayal is common. Revenge is rare, but victory that restores purpose, is rarer still. And as I closed my eyes in the office where my father had once dreamed alone, I knew this much: the best revenge isn't just winning. It's building something so enduring that your enemies dissolve into memory, while your legacy keeps breathing. The war for Morgan Biotech was over, and I was exactly where I belonged.